Welcome, everyone. The webinar will begin at the top of the hour and will be recorded. Connect with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. Please use the hashtag Learning Tuesdays, and tag us to tweet anything you've learned from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. So once again, the campaign wants to connect with you on Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. The webinar will begin shortly. It will be recorded and shared with you afterwards.
Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar, Helping Families Succeed in Challenging Times, Philanthropy's Response to COVID-19. My name is Sarah Torian, and I'm a consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, and I'm helping to manage this online learning series. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a couple of really quick housekeeping details with you. First of all, I'd invite you to introduce yourself. Use the chat box function on your Zoom screen and let us know your name, organization, and the name of the GLR coalition that you're a member of, if you're a member of a GLR coalition. Secondly, I wanted to share that all webinar attendees will be participating in listen-only mode during today's webinar. And that's to avoid any background noises or distractions during the presentations. But we do strongly encourage your active engagement throughout the webinar, and I would encourage you to share any thoughts or reflections on the presentations using the chat box, or any questions that might come to you during these presentations using the Q&A box. Now, for those of you who've been participating in these conversations for a while, I know we previously posted questions in the chat box, but we now have access to a Q&A box, which makes it much easier for us to track those questions as they come in and share them with our presenters. So look for that Q&A box in your Zoom screen and post your questions there. Third, I wanted to share that today's webinar is being recorded, and a link to that recording will be shared with all who registered for today's conversation in a follow-up email that will go out early next week, which will also include a link to the slide deck and other resources that will be shared during this conversation. So keep an eye out for that. And then finally, I just wanted to give you a heads up that we will be posting a very brief survey poll after the presentations are complete, and I'd encourage you to take just a couple of quick moments to share your thoughts and feedback in that survey poll so that we can use that information to continue our commitment to continuous improvement and making sure that these conversations are relevant to your work, informing your efforts, and meeting your needs. So look for that during the Q&A portion of the webinar. Now I'd like to share just a little bit of background about the GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar series. As you can see on your screen in front of you, we've got a number of great sessions planned for the coming weeks, always on Tuesdays, always starting at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And we're hoping that this predictable and reliable schedule will make it easier for you and for others in the network to make plans to join in for these conversations on a regular basis. We've now hosted a little bit more than 25 webinars since we launched the GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar series last September. So I'd also encourage you to check out CLIP. That's the campaign's Community Learning for Impact and Improvement platform, where you can find a growing archive of resources from these conversations, including all of the webinar recordings, slide decks, and other resources that were shared. Exploring the best science, ideas, and programs for our work to ensure early school success for more children from low-income families. And then I also hope that you'll continue to save this date and time and make plans to join in for more of these online learning events. Now, speaking of online learning events, many of you have probably received the update from the campaign about our plans for GLR Week 2020. We made the tough decision to cancel that in-person convening, but we are taking GLR Week 2020 virtual. So I hope you will continue to save that date and time. Just want to make sure that you know that we're still planning to offer an incredibly robust and rich agenda of multiple learning and sharing opportunities on each day throughout that week. So please do continue to save that date and make plans to join us for that. We'll be sending some more information about the agenda and how you can register for each of these sessions in the coming weeks and months. So keep an eye out for that. But now for today's conversation. I think all of our lives have changed fairly dramatically in the past couple of weeks. And while many of us are still struggling to find our footing, I know I am in this new normal in which we find ourselves, the situation is so much more urgent and challenging for the children and families who had been struggling before the schools, childcare centers, libraries, and community centers, as well as employers and businesses had to shutter their doors in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, as frontline practitioners are mobilizing to support these families now and in the coming months, philanthropic leaders are themselves working to understand the needs and position themselves to respond. And just how they're doing that is the topic for today's conversation. And to begin that conversation, I am incredibly honored to introduce our 4 panelists and 2 commentators. All 6 have long and distinguished bios, but because I think we're all eager to hear what they have to share with us today, I'm just going to share some of the highlights from each of those. But please know that I did share a link to longer bios for all of them in the chat box. It's posted on Clip, so you can find that there. First of all, we have Henry Berman, who will be serving as both moderator and co-presenter today. Henry has served as the CEO of Exponent Philanthropy since 2011 and served on its board from 2008 to 2010 when it was called the Association of Small Foundations. He's also served as the foundation president and a co-trustee and has a long career in educational media and technology. We will also be hearing from Lauren Smith, who is co-CEO of FSG and brings more than 25 years of experience working at the intersection of the healthcare delivery and management, public policy, and public health fields. She served as the medical director of the Massachusetts Department of Public Health during the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, and also as medical director of the Pediatric Inpatient Service at Boston Medical Center. We will also be hearing from Tony Fundaro, who is the president and CEO of Philanthropy Southwest, where he brings more than 20 years of executive leadership experience with foundations, nonprofits, and businesses. And we will also hear from Alicia Lara, who is the senior vice president for Impact at United Way Worldwide and previously served as vice president for community investment at the United Way of Los Angeles. While there, she helps the organization take steps to reduce homelessness, increase high school graduation rates, and improve the financial stability of low-income families. And then after our 4 presenters, we will hear from our 2 commentators for the day. They are Caldwell and David Kass. Caldwell is the president and CEO of the Council of Michigan Foundations, where he brings more than 25 years of government, nonprofit, and philanthropic experience. And David Kass serves as the Vice President of Government Affairs and Strategic Communications at the Council on Foundations, where he works extensively across the aisle to move policy that advances the greater good. So welcome, Henry, Lauren, Tony, Alicia, Kyle, and David. I know that everyone on the webinar with us today appreciates your being here and sharing your insights. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic over to Henry Berman, who will moderate today's conversation.
Sarah, thank you so much for those lovely introductions. I don't want any of the viewers to be fooled by our young looks. We really do have all that great experience. let's begin with Lauren. As Sarah mentioned, you were the medical director at the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. You currently work at FSG. So with that framing and that experience, what advice would you share with funders who've been working to support children's birth through third grade language and literacy developments as they face this, it's now becoming hackneyed session, but this expression, but this new normal of COVID-19 world? I think you're still muted. There you go. Oh, you unmuted and muted, I think. Here you are. Thank you.
Am I back now?
You are.
We had, you know, I have some people that I'm currently living with who would love to have a mute button for me, but alas, they haven't invented that yet. Well, thanks for the opportunity to respond and to have this conversation with you. I think that one of the things that I would start with, and this is an audience, you know, participants who are, I know, think deeply about children and what, you know, helps them thrive, is for us to, you know, consider the basic principles of how do we support families to provide the balance of protective factors to children and try to minimize their, you know, exposure to risk factors. And it's really, I think, remembering, of course, that children exist in that kind of context, so that everything that we can do to support their families to be better able to support them is really how we can think about it. And I know that people are confronting the really very real both health and economic, I would say, collateral damage of this pandemic. And on the health front, I would just mention two things. One is that many families or many kids that we might be most concerned about already exist in a setting where their health care and their public health infrastructure is precarious. So they might be living in families where they lose insurance, or you know, they come on and off, so they might be uninsured. They might also have issues related to the availability and the quality of the healthcare when they do deliver it. So that's on a good day, on a regular day. And now that the healthcare settings are being so burdened and overrun with folks who are ill with COVID-19, that further diminishes their capacity to meet the needs of kids and their families. So you take a fragile sort of system and add burden to it, you're going to have some more difficulties. The second thing I would say is just around what those basic needs. We're already hearing about people's experiences with increased food insecurity, increased sort of housing instability, and unfortunately, I'm sure folks who are participating have seen the increased data on exposure to violence, intimate and domestic violence. All, we could pick so many of those things, obviously we know are going to have an adverse impact on kids' health and well-being. So I guess I would say continue or start with paying close and careful attention to those folks who had significant vulnerabilities because of sort of historic and structural factors that excluded them before, knowing that those vulnerabilities have now been intensified, and it's not going to be a surprise where we find the concentration of adverse impact.
So as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking of a couple things. I'm thinking, one, you're talking about, and I think we all know this, but it's probably bears repeating, that, the children are a segment of a unit called the family. Now, in many cases, that family may be a single parent. It may be an aunt, an uncle, and grandparent. It's not necessarily the traditional family as we know it, but they are part of that unit. And then I think you touched on two other things that I think are really important, and I'd be curious how you think funders should perhaps be thinking about this. One is that many of these kids are going to lose meals. They're no longer in school, and that was getting them their breakfast. That was getting them their lunch. So they're missing a big piece of their nutrition, and without nutrition, learning is not going to be happening. I get that. And then also, I've been thinking a lot about the potential for increased violence within the home. There's no escape. One partner or whatever can't slam the door and jump in the car and drive down the street and go somewhere, or just walk to the corner bar or whatever. And so I fear for kids who may become victimized in this situation. So are there things that funders should be thinking about that is perhaps non-traditional in their world? They always thought, well, I'm helping kids learn to read, I'm supporting the campaign, but what are the things they should also be considering?
Well, I think that that's a great question, and I share all of those sort of fears and worries with you. And I would just add one to it, which is the learning loss that we are seeing on a really national scale in terms of the numbers of states that have now said that they're going to remain closed for the remainder of the school year. So adding on to all the things that you just said, for many kids, school is a place where they, can have some social connection. It offers some, an essential respite from some of the stressors that they might have at home, and some ability to have, mentors or other caring adults in their lives, as well as, of course, the educational component of school. And so now you've taken what we already know about summer learning loss and compounded it and doubled it, and what's that going to do for a whole nation's worth of kids? So I would add that concern. That's something that's keeping me up at night.
I'm gonna put you on the spot here a little, because I think you're making a great point. There's the summer slump that
Right.
would be expected under normal conditions. That would also have expected that the child had achieved a certain point by May or June, whenever the school system happens to let out. So now we've cut that back. So even under the best of conditions, they are not where we would have wanted them. And now we're compounding that. So just with a couple of my colleagues that I work with who have young children, they're wondering what's going to happen. And one of them said, well, should just K through maybe 11, because 12 gets a little funky with kids going off, but should K and 11 just all restart the year? I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I think that that's a debate that's happening now for the very reasons that you just talked about. That compounding or that exacerbation of the summer learning loss, 6 months. I mean, just what does it mean for kids to have been out of school from March until September? I'm trying to imagine what that would be like for that cadre of teachers and educators who are going to have to sort of take that entire sort of cohort of kids and help them get used to being back in school. I mean, it's tremendous. So I don't know that I've thought carefully enough about whether or not everyone should repeat a year, but I think the reason I shared it with you in terms of that worry is that that's something where the inequality that we see in, the educational trajectories and the educational outcomes for kids, are likely to just be intensified in such deep ways because of this. And we know that folks have different resources. I guess I would say, but back to your question around sort of how can funders respond, I would say that there's a tension that I would challenge to folks, and that is the ability to parallel process. We know that there are intense issues right now that are confronting families, as you mentioned, food insecurity and the loss of the nutritional sort of benefits of school breakfast and lunch. That is a critical, right now kind of triage thing. I know that school districts and their partners all around the country are coming up with different solutions to that. At the same time that one has to think about that immediate need, there needs to be some attention thinking about, well, how am I also going to be considering the medium term and longer term needs that we know and we can predict are going to be coming. And if we don't prepare for them now, we're going to be, in the fall, as an example, looking at this entire, cohort of kids who've been out of school for 6 months and not sort of be prepared for how we're going to rectify that or how we're going to address that. So the hard thing is that there's a lot of things to pay attention to, but my recommendation for foundations is, to the extent that you can, really acknowledge that there are these two timelines that you're working on. And yes, you have to address the needs of the people right before you, and you have to save some time and energy for those other medium and longer term things, or else I would say the compounding of the adverse sort of things that we're seeing now will be further intensified or explode further, down the line.
Yeah, I mean, if I were to draw a parallel with the classic natural disaster, a Hurricane Harvey, a Katrina, an earthquake or whatnot, there's certainly the what I refer to as the blankets and coffee phase, and I think we're still there right now. What do we do in the immediate to help people? And then there's going to be a rebuilding phase, but then there's going to be that long-term phase of what are the long-term effects, particularly depending on how schools play out with bringing these children along. If they shortchange them, that's going to have repercussions, I think, that'll play out over many years that we need to think about. And we won't know that totally, but it is multi-stage.
And I think the other thing I would add to that, because I think you're exactly right, is the need to partner perhaps with folks that you may not regularly come in contact with if you're thinking primarily in the education space. But when we started off this part of our conversation talking about bolstering parents and families' abilities and their capacity to buffer these stressors, I mean, we know that when children experience traumatic events, or people talk about toxic stress, the adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, when they experience those, the capacity or the ability of those adults around them to essentially buffer them from that and kind of, you can imagine it, sort of offer antidotes and detoxify that environment. What can we do to support families to be able to do that now? So that's in your sort of blankets and coffee phase, but also knowing that we're going to need, those families are going to need resources and supports sort of moving forward. So essentially, it's like, how do you decrease the intensity of those stressors, and how do you decrease the overall number, and then how do you provide folks with resources and opportunities so that they can do that? Because I think parents, if nothing else, want to be able to do for their kids and to protect them. But the stories that you and I, I'm sure, are reading around families being laid off from work, having low wage work, they're at home, they're not able to sort of make ends meet. That's creating stress. They're not necessarily prepared to be the primary educators of their kids, to step into that educational role. And they have all these other competing priorities around, keeping a roof over their head, food and all those other things. So, and then the last thing I would say is like, how can we think about the social disruption? I read just such a poignant and moving story about a young man here in Boston who, the thing he missed most about school was being able to connect with his teachers and, obviously his friends, and being able to have those informal touch points with adults during the day that sort of bolster his interest and keep him engaged and help him feel like he's making progress. And, in Boston public schools, and I'm sure in many, they don't have an infrastructure for doing that, and so he's kind of adrift. And how do we, what could philanthropy do to support educators and others to be able to sort of bridge that divide, I think would be important.
So one last thought, maybe you have a comment on it or whatnot, as I heard Dr. Fulci, I think it was yesterday or the day before, talk about, we're never going to return to the same normal. There will be a new normal, and obviously we all hope it's soon, that there's a time that we're out of our homes and all of that. But, in terms of a public health crisis and a long-term crisis, I believe, if we compare this again to those natural disasters, when we come out of our homes in a natural disaster, you drive down the street and you see buildings that are destroyed, you see homes that are flooded, you see the impact. When we come out of this, we're going to see kids getting off the school bus or walking down the street or riding their bike to school, and that's going to look very similar. And so I think there may be a tendency to actually forget about what's underlying it, because there's no great visuals for the 6 o'clock news. And so stuff will get buried, and it's incumbent upon all of us, funders, educators, parents, whatever, I think, to remember that and not think that, oh, you know, little Johnny, little Mary's going off to school with their books and everything's fine.
Right, right. And I think that sort of maintaining that commitment to deep understanding. So, you know, hearing from families, hearing from educators, talking to students, being able to really understand what their experiences are and continue to be, so that funders are prepared to use their full array of superpowers, if you will, not only their grant making, but their ability to convene, their ability to sort of heighten issues that others may not be paying attention to, their ability to sort of ask provocative questions that other folks may not be able to, you know, be in a position, use their social capital, in other words, not just their actual capital, but their social capital. So there's lots of ways, I think, that in the scenario that you just talked about, funders can do quite a bit beyond only their grant making.
Yeah, I think if I had to sum it up in one word, it's communicate, which involves both listening and speaking and being a voice.
Yeah.
Lauren, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I think we're going to jump now from Boston down to the Southwest in Texas and talk to Tony. And Tony has an interesting background in that, I guess like myself to some extent, he's worked both inside of nonprofits, and more recently, Tony, you're working in the philanthropy, in the funder world rather, in your role at Philanthropy Southwest. So you've got a foot in each camp. You have experience in both. So could you share with us a little bit about what you see the role of philanthropy in responding to the virus is, and maybe a little bit more specifically, or by illustrative purposes, you know, what's Philanthropy Southwest doing to respond? What actions are your members taking in response to the virus?
Sure. Thanks, Henry, and good afternoon, everyone, from Dallas, Texas, and representing the Southwest. Just really quickly, Philanthropy Southwest plays a very unique and behind-the-scenes role in really being a resource to foundations throughout the Southwest region of the United States. We really take a role of collaboration, learning together, as well as advocacy. So I'm really speaking from the perspective of our foundations and our funders and how they've responded. In general, I've been very proud of them. They very much rolled up their sleeves and got to work immediately and working with their nonprofits. I think the first step was really checking in on grantees and the organizations that they partner with in the communities, asking how they can support directly, making sure the normal processes of applications and requirements are sort of minimized, if not significantly reduced, or not even completely eliminated in some cases. They have really responded immediately, as well as getting grants out the door for operational funding. There is a real movement to ensure that they are propping up the service organizations, because that's the role of the funder, and that they're streamlining reporting and things like that. And then I think, as you've mentioned a few times when you and Lauren were talking, there's this immediate response, and then there's the reality of the economic fallout that's beyond this. And so there's already a proactive thinking around how do our foundations mobilize themselves to think about this economic aftermath? What's that going to mean? There are, this is a bit sensitive, but there are a lot of conversations, and it's sad to say, both as an entrepreneur in the nonprofit world and one who started a couple of nonprofits and ran them for many years, probably some won't continue to exist because of the economic fallout. So what does it look like to merge nonprofits? How do we continue to make sure that those that are serving the most vulnerable, and you know, in our area, we both have very urban areas, Phoenix, Dallas, Fort Worth area, Houston, but also rural areas, and responding to health in rural areas and responding to rural areas can be very different. And so what's that look like? What's the future look like? And a few examples of how our Southwest foundations are responding to that in particular, which I think is a bit of a overview of kind of how a lot of our foundations are responding, depending on what type they are. We have very many types of foundations, and like I said, throughout 7 different states in the U.S. I want to focus on 4 of those. One is the Episcopal Health Foundation in Harris County in Houston. Them in particular because they both focus in an urban area, but also in a rural area. And their focus is really a long-term strategic solution. And what I mean by that, they're familiar with responding to natural disaster. Of course, Hurricane Harvey was in 2017, so there was a bit of an ecosystem that was already there. And they've taken the approach of how do they maintain the viability of the healthcare providers throughout Harris County. Like I mentioned, that's in the rural area and the urban area. So they're really opening up funding to those healthcare organizations, making sure they have what they need. And then the other nonprofits they support around different other health outcomes.
Hey, Tony, excuse me a second.
Yes,
when you talk about them, reaching out and helping them and stuff, is that being done in a manner consistent as you talked about earlier about, making things happen quicker, checking in with them? You talked about, eliminating red tape, if I can use that term. They're putting that into practice?
They are. I've seen, the next example I have on here, Bonfils Stanton Foundation in Denver, Colorado, they focused on arts and creatives, and, that group of folks have really been hit hard, especially those that are up and coming because they're both working in service industry and trying to do their art as well. And so they've created an emergency fund immediately for 43 arts and culture organizations in and around Denver. And that's been a steady, regular thing that I've heard. How do we maintain the services that our nonprofits are providing? What do they need to do that? And so there's been a much more openness for operations and not necessarily having direct, immediate results and measurements and those kind of things. So we've definitely seen that for sure.
And do you find people, are they being concerned? Particularly as the stock market, took huge tumble. I think it's been up a couple of days, which is good, but nevertheless, it's still way down. Are they being concerned about their assets, or as I like to say, is this the proverbial rainy day? And they understand that if they're not spending it now, they may not be around to spend it.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the proverbial rainy day, no doubt. One that's not on here that comes to mind is El Pomar Foundation, which set aside $1 million immediately in Colorado. They're a 80-year-old legacy foundation. We have a lot of foundations as well in other rural areas that own assets like major oil, farms, ranches, et cetera. And so they're having to respond to all those employees as well. But it's definitely money out the door right now. I do think, since there's a lot of nonprofits on this call, and being a former nonprofit leader myself, I think it's wise to think about not just this year, but what does this mean next year in 2021? Absolutely. I think that is going to be the bigger question of grant making. I would stay in constant communication with your funders as much as possible. I know your focus is the mission, but maybe begin to drop some seeds of what your plans are for next year I don't mean immediately, but over maybe starting in May, June, as we seem to come out of this a bit, or a little later. But think about what 2021 looks like for you as well. I think that's be a smart thing to do.
I think that's incredibly smart advice.
Yeah. And then we had one Flynn Foundation. We have several of our foundations doing this. Virginia D. Piper, they're in the Arizona area, Maricopa County, Phoenix, around there, and they're really funding a lot of population-based testing. So they're trying to meet the need immediately with grants around how do they play a role as a foundation in making sure there's as many tests as possible. So taking the advice of the CDC and people like Dr. Fauci and what we're hearing, that's going to be key. And so we have some foundations that are really investing into that as well. And then, mention this, but want to mention Kilpatrick Foundation, Oklahoma City Community Foundation in Oklahoma, creating a larger fund as well for relief. And then one that's not on here, NAP Community Care Foundation. I have to mention the border. We serve foundations that are all on the border except California. So the uniqueness of how are they responding to undocumented workers, to the agricultural industry. What does it look like for the environmental funder to stay focused on what they need to as well in this time is a big concern. But I think right now there's a lot of funding available. I would and an openness to operations. So my advice is do everything you can to get that funding now, and then think about what 2021 looks like from the economic impact because it's going to have on our society and our communities.
I'd follow up on that, Tony, with, and I say this sort of sadly as being a foundation guy right now, but certainly many foundations have the, what's the right word, the not good title or reputation of, having a power dynamic and not being willing to listen as much. And I'm seeing that being thrown out the door right now. And there is great communication. So as a nonprofit, this is the time, as you wisely said, to talk to them, start to lay those seeds for 2021. And I would even argue, a little bit further, because I think this is, in terms of children and their ability to read, and it's going to ripple forward. This will not just be like, oh, we're all back in school, everything's fine. This was not a blizzard where we missed a week of school. So thinking forward and engaging those funders to be your partner, I think you're spot on. Yeah.
We say around here it's very important that funders work with nonprofits and grantees, not to nonprofits and grantees. And I think you're right. There's a great equalization happening right now, which I think is good for that power dynamic. But I'm very, very proud of the Philanthropy Southwest members and the way they've responded. I see them coming out quickly, immediately, and being thoughtful of the future and what they need to hold up the organizations now. They realize there's those on the front lines fighting this every day, and I'm very proud of our members.
Great. Well, thank you for leading them and for all they're doing. And I'm watching the clock because I could keep, as a couple of foundation guys, keep talking, but then I'll get in trouble. So moving on to Alicia. Let's talk a little bit, if you will, about what you're hearing through the United Way networks. What issues are people bringing up? What are their requests? And I know there are multiple channels. There's the 211 system. There's other systems. What are you hearing? What's on people's minds and their needs?
Yeah, thanks, Henry, for this opportunity. First, I want to say hello to all of my United Way colleagues. I know you guys are working so hard, so I appreciate everything that you're doing. I talk to so many of you, and I know things are hard, and you guys are hanging in there. So to everybody, actually, on the line, but I just want to give a big shout out to United Way folks out there. What I want to do is talk a little bit, and what you'll see here is just to underscore some of what you've already been hearing and some of the conversation that you and Lauren had. If folks aren't familiar, there is 211, which is a national network of about 240 211 centers, about half of which are operated by United Way. It was birthed out of United Way. The other half are financially supported or have some kind of partnership with their local United Way. We cover about 96% of the country, and that the slide you see actually is an internal slide, just to give people a sense within the network just about the scale. We generally handle about 12 million calls a year. We're going to far surpass that just because of what's happening here through a combination of live person-to-person phone calls, through the web, and through chats. Really what I want to draw your attention to is what we're seeing as requests. So generally 211 is that in non-crisis, and I would just say broadly national crisis, but in everyday crises, people are calling 211 because they're about to get evicted. They're in some kind of violent situation. They're looking for a resource to get out and find shelter, food, whatever those things are. So multiply that by whatever, XL, like to the max, to show, in fact, what people have been calling about. And as you might imagine, things have shifted over time. So in the beginning, where we would have been, say, in late February-ish, mid-February to early March, people were starting to call concerns about COVID in and of itself from a health perspective. What are the symptoms? I'm confused about the messages that I'm getting. I want to get tested, those kinds of things. And as things started to really ramp up, things started to shift. And then, of course, towards the end of March, people were really stressed out about being able to make ends meet. They were getting furloughed, they were getting laid off, and so we were getting increases in eviction prevention. Like, I hear my local mayor has put in a moratorium around eviction, but my landlord is saying X. What's the right information? Access to food, diapers, medications, any of those kinds of things, because now they were in a situation where they couldn't go down to the supermarket because they weren't working anymore. Then it became about, I've lost my job, I can't file unemployment claims, I'm on the phone for 4 hours, what's happening, can you help me? Or I would need to file a claim, please help me do that. And then what we've started to see, of course, is an increase, to Lauren's point, an increase in anxiety, in stress, depression, violence, all these kinds of things. As the crisis continues to drag on, people are experiencing and needing some kind of connection. They're feeling socially isolated, or now they're beginning to experience other kinds of issues. So what we find is that the inequities that have been in our country, if I could just say as a side comment, are being laid bare right in front of us every single day, whether it's digital divide, whether it's access to ongoing health, and how this disease is progressing, to income, who gets to be an essential employee and you can't get child care. How are you going to deal with that? How are you going to deal with you're an hourly, you've been furloughed? So all these things are coming into play. So how most United Ways are dealing with it, and most United Ways have created their own response emergency fund. And I talk to United Ways, and we talk about Safe Harbor. First and foremost, are your organizations that provide basic needs, can you support them with some general operating support? Is there any additional funding that you can give to them around basic needs to expand access to whatever those things are? So I'm a big supporter of general operating support. Would encourage funders that are on the phone to really think about how you actually might reimagine current grants that might be restricted to be unrestricted at this point in time. You can always go back to that. But I think philanthropy needs to reimagine itself as well as a result of what's happening here, and frankly, the long hangover that we're going to have from COVID. So that's just, that was my rant. I apologize, Henry, but that's 2 in 1. And then we can go on after that, but go ahead. I'm sure you've got another.
Yeah, no, I thought that was great. And when I particularly look at your slide and the 4 bullet points there in the lower right of the most requested information, again, some of that I think fits that model of the immediacy of what are the symptoms, how do I get tested? Mental health support is going to last for a long time.
Absolutely.
There will be, I'm sure there will be kids, there will be adults who, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, pick up a common cold and they're going to have flashbacks and worry. Is this something else? So I think that's really important. And I think you also touched on, not that, hopefully not that any of us were unaware of the equity issues that exist in this country. I think this is helping to perhaps exacerbate them even further. Once the COVID virus is conquered, tamed, and I understand that could be a long time till there's that magic vaccine. A lot of us will get that vaccine, we'll be safe, we will have a new normal, but we still get to go home at night to a bed. We still get to pick up a book off the shelf because we can read it. We still have a meal to go to. And for many people, they're going to go back to, they're still looking for meals. They're still looking for shelter. And so we have to think about all that. And as it relates to the education of the next generation, if they're not educated and, if they're not reading, they're not getting educated, that just becomes, uber critical to have them survive. Or else we're just going to create yet another generation of disenfranchised that doesn't help anybody. So, so the government passes this $2 trillion special bill. What was it, a week ago, a week and a half ago, something like that. And I understand that the United Way, along with many others, but the United Way in particular, are helping families try and understand that, navigate through the process, which I've heard from many people is anything but simple. What are you hearing from people? Is there frustration? Are they figuring out how to do it? Are they throwing their hands up in despair? And at the same time, there's talk of yet another bill already being worked on. What's missing? Right. What should we be pushing for?
Right. Well, and if we can go on to the next slide, let's just talk about the United Way network. Most United Ways and a lot of other partners have been involved in what's called the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program, otherwise known as VITA, and it's a free tax preparation. And it's really a great way not only to help people prepare and submit their taxes for free in a high quality way. Volunteers are IRS certified, and so you get your return. It's 100% of your return. You don't have to pay anyone for it. There's no one asking you to take out a loan for it or anything like that. But really what it does is for working families, low-income families, it helps access the earned income tax credit, which could be thousands of dollars depending on where you are and where you are in your tax bracket. This is really, really important, and now more than ever, people need to have money in their pocket. So part of the CARES Act, which I'll talk about in a second, allows for that. The immediate crisis that we had in front of us is that there was thousands of VITA sites throughout the country, and practically overnight, which is really over like a 2 to 3 week period, that entire ecosystem closed down. So now we're faced with how on earth are we going to help people prepare to get their taxes prepared, and then when you can't be in front of them. So that made it really hard. And so we do have something that's called My Free Taxes, which is an okay product. If you have a really simple return, you can access that for free. They are making it available to access stimulus. Again, I'll talk about that in a sec. And we've started to partner with Code for America around an online tax preparation option. And some United Ways have been involved in piloting that. And so we're hoping to get that up and out and scaled. We've been having conversations with folks around being able to get that up and scaled in all 50 states before the July 15th, which is the new tax deadline that's in place. So again, what we're trying to do is get funds in the hands of people so that they can use, since they've had such an interruption in their spending money. So if you go into the next slide, let me just say a little bit about the CARES Act so that just people know. So this is just so that you have it in front of you. So the guidance has been, this is all pretty fresh guidance over the last 2 weeks. For anyone that's receiving Social Security, and if you're eligible to receive some funding under the CARES Act, they're going to use the Social Security backbone to get that money out. Because so at first they were saying everybody had to file a simple tax form in order to access that funding. So now they've taken Social Security recipients off, which is terrific. Mm-hmm. Then what they did is that if you filed in 2018 or 2019, you'll not be required to submit any kind of additional tax forms. What that leaves for us are people that have been so low income that they've not filed taxes in years. And I saw a figure that said there's probably about 7 million people in that category. And so those are the folks that all of us would really have to go after. And it's a simple form. And you never know what earned income tax assistance, the EITC rather, the credit might garner. You might be just a couple of $100, but it could fully qualify them for the full $1,200 that they could get. So I know My Free Taxes is working on an option around that. Code for America is, so more to come around that. But these are the things that most immediately folks on the ground are working on.
I think there's a really important thing, and I think I'll probably touch on it when Sarah puts me on the hot seat here. But you know, there's a whole economy, a whole population of people who are undocumented, who, as you said, don't have enough money to be even filing taxes, who are going to be just left out of the system as I don't want to say broken, because I think it's getting thrown together very quickly, but as difficult as the system is for someone to navigate who has some sense of what they're doing, those people who are on the outside, I think, are probably a population we all need to be very aware of, and ultimately will be vital to building the economy back up. These are the dishwashers,
Agreed.
These are the agriculture workers, these are the housekeepers in hotels or whatever, and we need them. I mean, forget about the humanitarian reasons for doing this, but we need them. So Alicia, I want to thank you, and I think I'm supposed to hand it back to Sarah now. Is that correct?
Yes, and then I'll pass it right back to you in just a second, Henry. So thank you so much for moderating these great conversations with our previous co-presenters, but now I'd like to, as you said, put you on the hot seat. I know that Exponent Philanthropy has been hosting weekly discussions with your network to hear how they're responding to the COVID-19 crisis. What are you hearing from them in terms, in particular, of the needs of parents of young children during this crisis, and how are they responding to those needs?
So yes, correct. We host a weekly Friday afternoon discussion, much like this. It's open to anybody. You don't have to be a member or whatever to participate. And we're talking to members and hearing what they're doing. And perhaps I'm going to maybe reverse the answer to your question, because I think some of what they're doing then becomes evident with how they're helping children and families, which is, and I think there are things that Tony certainly touched on, and we've touched on so far today, but they're providing more flexible funding. They're reducing or eliminating red tape reports. They're streamlining grant applications. They're getting funds directly to the people who need them, and that may mean giving to individuals. We held a webinar last week on how can a foundation do that, because it is very doable, but there are certain procedures. It's a government program. You need to follow the rules. They're contributing to relief funds. They're giving more than they planned. They're surveying their grantees for what their needs are right now. And as Tony was alluding to, what are going to be their needs in 6 months, in 18 months, in 2 years, so that they can be thinking about that and planning with them. And like, I think all of us, they're going viral in their operations, which has caused them. I know of one funder who ended up buying Zoom accounts for all of their nonprofits, because suddenly these nonprofits were working remotely. And how do they keep in touch? How do these teachers stay together? Because they're all now, even if they're teaching online, they've lost the ability to socialize in the classic teacher's room or at the water cooler or the coffee pot. So letting them do that. And the other big one is people are moving to electronic payments. So that if you and I were having a conversation, we're going to use some additional funding, Sarah, it's, a few keystrokes and bang, it's in your bank account. It's not write a check, put it in the mail, hope the mail gets there, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, if I summed it up in a couple of words, it's people are listening, people are partnering. And oh yeah, I mean, many of them are moving to GenOp funding. They're just saying whatever grants you had are now GenOp. Use them however you need them. We trust you. And that's the key to all of this, is trust. Trust comes from communications. That's a cycle that works together.
And so I know that you wear a number of hats. I know one of the hats that you wear is serving as a trustee of a foundation that's focused on young children and early literacy. What are you seeing, in that role, and how is that foundation responding?
So we've done a few things. We reached out immediately as this started to really explode to our funders who are really in the trenches doing the direct service work. So not the mega people that we help support who have, armies of development officers or whatnot, but talking to those small nonprofits, talking to those schools or whatever, and saying, just literally the first phone call was, how are you doing? And could you use an extra $5,000 right now to buy cleaning supplies, or if somebody is out because they're quarantined and you need to backfill? And all it took for them to get the $5,000 was say yes. That was it. Check gets written, here it is. Interestingly enough, a couple of nonprofits said, that's really generous, but we still need a little bit of time to assess what we really need, which just increases the trust factor. It makes me want to give them more money because they're being smart about it. It's, Tony in particular, I recall, but I think everybody was talked about talking to people and communicating. So one organization we funded, said, gee, we're interested in buying Chromebooks for our students who are now all at home. What's it going to cost? We went through all that. And then, whatever the number was they wanted, we said to them, well, we're going to give you money to buy X plus 10% because we know some are going to get damaged. Some kid's going to spill whatever all over it. And then that kid shouldn't be held to a disadvantage because technology, whether intentionally, unintentionally, whatever, failed him or her. So I would urge funders to really probe and think. There may be many nonprofits, many schools that are afraid to say, could we get more? In fact, on the Chromebook example, between the first ask and when they actually located them, the price went up. And they said, well, we told you we needed this. So if we could just buy, that'll be enough for half. So then we'll just decide which students should get them. And we basically said, no, that's really foolish. Here's more money, buy all of them. It's not, we're not an ATM. It's not an endless pot. But I will share that I don't think we've really studied our portfolio of late. This is, as I said, this is the rainy day. This is when stuff has to happen. And people need to take on that role.
Right, that immediate response and recognizing that the crisis is real and needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and it all came out of having good relationships. It's the ability to call them up or them to call us up and say, I literally answered an email today from one long-term school reading program. I think we had made a 4-year commitment or maybe a year into it. And they said, we'd love to have a phone call with you to talk about how next year is going to be different and what we're thinking about. And let's sort of troubleshoot this together. They don't necessarily have all the answers. We certainly don't, but let's put our heads together. That's how we're going to get through this, in partnership, not in any kind of adversarial relationship.
That listening and trusting relationship. Well, great. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to pass the mic back over to you so that you can engage our commentators in conversation. And then for those of you on the call or on the webinar, please continue to post questions into the Q&A box on your Zoom screen, and I'll be sharing those with our presenters and commentators in just a few minutes.
Okay, thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
So as you can see on the screen, lovely photos of Kyle and David, both with a lot of experience and perspective. I've known Kyle for many years, so I'm going to start with you, Kyle. And the question is, what did you hear today in these presentations that resonated with you, given your experience? And what have you heard from your networks, and how does it match or not match? And then David, I'm going to ask you the same question, so you have a little time to think while we ask Kyle first.
Well, thanks, Henry. Well, just to get to it quickly, first off, thanks to everyone for participating, and thanks for this coalition for getting us all together. I think there's 3 things that I heard. One is around conditions, the second is around practice, and the third is around policy. So when we think about the conditions on the ground, I heard loud and clear that the basics are the basics, and food, water, shelter, education, health, safety, all of those needs are amplified. And I think the biggest challenge with COVID-19 is that what we're finding now in communities, and especially for families, is that the disease does not discriminate, but generally speaking, our response strategies do. And we're seeing equity issues really come out pretty loud and clear here when we think about access to food, access to healthcare, access to education opportunities. In Michigan alone, we're seeing that with the shutting down of our education system, and we being one of the lowest states to adopt broadband, that virtual education opportunities are very difficult. When we look at some of the practice habits that are being adopted, I think Michigan reflects a lot of what the good practice we're hearing from our friends out west. There's over 31 pooled emergency response funds that have been developed in different regions across our state. Some are able to, like you said, Henry, with your great foundation, able to turn around one paragraph applications or no paragraph applications in 24 hours, expediting funds through United Ways, large pushes to support the 211 system. Many of our members have signed on to the pledge that the Council on Foundations published. I think a lot of funders are trying to figure out what's flexibility, because they know that the endowments are going to take a hit, and the resource pool, while important, the flexibility right now and advance payments to grants they know are in the queue are ways that they can provide great assistance. And then I think the next, getting into the policy arena, I would just sort of point out that a lot of our funders were deeply engaged in turning out nonprofits for the census. We were the #3 early reporting state for the census. We accredit that a lot to the nonprofit engagement and the way foundations have stood up a large pooled fund to help support that work. We unfortunately are #3 in COVID cases and deaths. So what we're seeing is that for a lot of the policy work that we were doing around census, it's the same population that we were trying to reach. So turning some of the messages and some of the networks that we were using to reach people through the census, we're probably going to use that same network to reach those same vulnerable populations for COVID-19 response. We had one great example. We have the largest concentration of Arab Americans in the country. One of our largest nonprofits, Access, has a community foundation, and they stood up an emergency testing program for medical staff to do drive-up testing, just so that they could be sure that the medical staff were safe and being tested. It was something that they could do because of their access to a lot of the healthcare professionals in their network. I think the other policy pieces that we're seeing is a lot of nonprofits, fortunately, thanks to the advocacy of David and others, were eligible for the nonprofit loan funds through the Small Business Administration guaranteed loans. But the capacity for banks to service nonprofits, because many of the nonprofits didn't have the same relationships that other small businesses had, was a big need. So a lot of our members and funders are supporting the technical assistance to get nonprofits access to capital, which is going to relieve their burdens as well. I think I'll just end with those, Henry, and just say that for a lot of the work that we're seeing, I think the 3 tranches of immediate response, replenish, because there's waves to this crisis, both in the healthcare and the economic distress, and then the rebuilding and recovery are going to be really important for all of us to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think all wonderful points, Kyle, and I think in particular the mention of helping people navigate the SBA system or the government system to get these loans. it looks great for politicians to say, we put all this money out there, and that's a long way from putting it into the pockets of those nonprofits. So I think an important thing for all of us to keep our eye on, which sort of is a mediocre transition into policy. So David, your thoughts on what you heard today?
Unmute there. Thank you so much, and really appreciate the opportunity to be on this call. Kyle mentioned the pledge that we've been working on. I first just want to start with that. So more than 525 foundations around the country have signed this pledge, and those who sign it are pledging to do a number of things that people have mentioned on this call, providing flexible general operating support, reducing grant restrictions, and really talking to their grantees about what do you need? How can we help? So I would just encourage any funder on the call or for any nonprofits to talk to your funders, encourage them to look at the pledge and see if that's the right thing for them. Because, as several people have said, today, this is the rainy day. There was also a terrific statement that we signed on to with 8 other philanthropy serving organization leaders, calling for increased funding by all grant makers. United Philanthropy Forum and Hispanics in Philanthropy, Independent Sector, a number of others signed on to. It's on our website, and I think that is a pretty strong statement about why it's so important for the funding world to step up during this time. Just a third thing around that, we joined 5 peer corporate philanthropy networks in calling for companies to give more support to nonprofits during this time. And then there's another statement where 60 peer philanthropy serving organizations signed together to keep equity at the forefront in response to the coronavirus. In terms of policy, just to build on what Kyle said, I think generally our challenge has really been that the Hill tends to forget that nonprofits are out there and give funding for profits. And the bill that passed a week ago Friday, the $2 trillion bill, didn't do that as much. I mean, at least nonprofits can qualify. So there's a letter going up to the Hill, I assume the next day, that the National Council for Nonprofits is leading, that we're going to join on to, that just talks about, to please consider making sure that there's that whatever funding that a specific piece of it goes to nonprofits, because as we all know, many nonprofits just don't have that kind of access to banks and to or the special relationship with banks and other things to be able to get it quickly. So that's a piece. And then we're also going to be pushing to have the universal charitable deduction, which was passed as part of that bill for $300. Let's try to expand it so we can get more money going out that for people to encourage charitable giving at the individual level for those during these tough times are able to do it. So, I think it is a time where it looks like there will be probably a 4th bill, and there's talk about increasing unemployment insurance, increasing the small business loans, the Paycheck Protection Program. Any nonprofit that has not tried to sign up for that, I certainly encourage you to do that. So those are a couple of things that are happening at the policy level, and hope that's helpful.
Thanks, David. I think you make a great point, or multiple points, about the importance of addressing everything associated with the COVID-19 virus. You and everybody today, I guess, really on so many levels. There's working on government to make things happen, just as there's working to get food and shelter to people and getting medical care. And this is really a multifaceted response that we all have to be in, and to use the cliche again right now, but all in it together to make happen. So my thanks to all the panelists and to David and Kyle for your commentary. I think this is when I get to hand it back to Sarah, and she takes over for the rest of the way. So thanks everybody for letting me be part of your program.
Thank you so much, Henry, and thank you to all of the presenters and commentators. And don't go far, Henry, because you are not done yet. We've got a number of questions that folks have shared for all of our presenters and commentators today. So maybe we could all turn our screens back on or our videos back on so that we could all engage in this conversation. One of the questions, and Kyle, I think you were getting at this a little bit in your comments, but what about addressing the digital divide? You know, how can we work to ensure that all poor and low-income families and children have access to the internet, especially as schools are now turning to the internet and devices to make sure, or to continue delivering their education and instructions as we have closed schools right now. Who is working on this? Who should be out working on this? Who is not currently working on this? And you know, what are some of the? It seems as if some vital resources are now being made available online. But how can we make sure that low-income families and low-income children can access those resources?
It's a great question. I'll draw the analogy to sort of the challenges we're having with getting the groceries. You can stock all the shelves, but if you can't get people to the store, they can't get fed. And if they can't afford the groceries when they get to the store, you're not doing them any favors by standing them in front of a store full of goods they can't use. And I think this is what we're seeing with access to online teaching instruction. So first off, who should be involved? Well, right now you have to make sure that the pipe is available to the houses where in homes and other apartments and where vulnerable populations are living, so that everyone has access. So it's difficult for a family and a young person to not go to the school that they used to be connected to and to be told that, well, you're just going to have to get instruction virtually, when they can't even afford to pay their cell phone bill, let alone their cable bill. So I think that there has to be a scalable solution where the utilities are, broadband is seen as a vital utility. Philanthropy can help by being a partner to leverage opportunities to build broadband access into hard to reach communities, to provide matching funds for access to tablets and so forth. But the scale of the internet access issue is a larger one than what philanthropy can carry. I think the second piece is that teachers are going to need support and training to teach virtually. My wife is a former teacher, my daughter is a current teacher, and they were taught to teach in person. They were not taught to teach virtually. So I think philanthropy can help by providing the professional support for professional development for teachers to teach in a virtual environment, and especially for the most vulnerable. I shudder to think my daughter is a special education teacher. How do you teach in a virtual environment for kids who need direct socialization and direct contact with a teacher? So I think philanthropy can help in those areas. And then the last thing I'll just say is that there's going to have to be a really hard look in education departments across the country on how they think about a delayed school year, a summer learning loss that is extended onto months. And frankly, we don't know if there will be an end to this crisis or a diminishing and then a resurge. So I think philanthropy can help departments of education across the country think about how they change their systems to be year-round delivery in case we aren't able to return to the agrarian calendar.
Sarah, I'd like to, if it's okay, jump in on Kyle's remarks and just add a couple of comments. That okay?
Yes, please.
Just getting permission, raising my hand. Two things for funders to think about, particularly as it relates to the future of technological education, as Kyle spoke to. Many foundations, many funders are involved in impact investing. And I would suggest that investing in firms and businesses that are developing new educational technologies is indeed a form of impact investing, so that they are creating the tools that will be for the future classroom. That's number one. The other thing, going back to the digital divide, the big lesson here for us, and I think it's going to be shame on us if we don't think about this, is the digital divide existed before the virus appeared. The digital divide will exist after the virus is cured or tamed, whatever we want to say. So we need to be thinking about what are the other issues that are preventing good development of our children, that we shouldn't have to wait for a crisis to say, oh, we should deal with this. So I don't know what those are necessarily. We could probably do a whole webinar just on what they might be, but I think there's a real lesson there for all of us to be thinking about that and looking forward. So just one thought.
And that's a great point. That's kind of like that addressing immediate needs while thinking about what are the needs that are going to be long range, both as in response to this, but also thinking beyond that. Do any other presenters or commentators have thoughts to share about this question of kind of broadband and internet access and digital divide?
Sarah, this is Alicia. I would just say I kind of feel like with digital divide, we've seen this movie before. So I want to get myself in trouble here. I think that internet companies are doing what the redlining that we've seen in the development of housing. And as you see major corporations going through mergers to get content as well as dominate the internet, you know, there's a role for Congress. There's a role for local government, and this is where we have to really push that. If they want these giant mergers or they want to do something, first and foremost, are we looking at this through an equity lens to ensure that we don't have a redlining crisis? And to Henry's point, shame on us if in 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, we look back and go, oh my God, we've done this again. So that's my only comment.
Mm-hmm. So thinking kind of beyond like direct access to internet and the tech tools like the Chromebooks that we were mentioning and other devices that people would use, does anybody have any thoughts? We've got a question about how is philanthropy supporting and equipping parents to help their children continue to learn? So getting beyond having access to just the internet and the tools to deliver and access that information. But then what, you know, supporting parents once they have that in their hands. And how are we working to, or how is philanthropy working to improve the connection between parents and teachers as we're in this remote learning, distance learning kind of situation, and strengthen that homeschool connection? You know, we've always or frequently said that parents are the most important partner. That's the case now more than ever. So is there a role that philanthropy can play in that situation? Are you all aware of funders or philanthropies that are working in that area?
This is Kyle. I would say that the networks, the funder networks that are supporting after school programs are largely pushing on this right now. So when you think about the vast array of nonprofits that are now making the shift from being quote unquote after school to being all time, all school, a lot of them are engaging parents, they're engaging teachers to try to make the connections. They're actually the bridge builders. Some that are also in the food delivery system are also working with teachers and nonprofits to find the kids who need assistance. So sometimes it's the other services that allow teachers and students and the nonprofits to connect. And so funders that are supporting the after school programs and networks that are in that space, I think are largely the front line in trying to keep everyone connected.
And once again, I'm gonna follow Kyle and some of his remarks that, you know, earlier, Kyle, you talked about helping educate teachers to teach in this new world, that, you know, teachers were taught to teach in the classroom. And now there's more online teaching, and that will continue to happen. I think there needs to be an element of also helping educate parents how they utilize this technology with their kids, because as a parent, they may not understand that role. We can engage parents, but do they have the understanding of how this new form of education is going to be developed and used? And once it's figured out, helping them to be partners in a more active way rather than just a passive way with the teachers.
Yeah. Can I?
What?
So I don't mean to pile on, but Henry and I love each other, so I just love to follow Henry. He likes to follow me. I would say too that the other thing that it's sort of an odd redo, but several of our public TV stations are just blowing out their education programming, the K-12 education programming. And so, you know, what I had growing up with Sesame Street is Sesame Street on steroids now when you look at the public broadcasting and the way that free access is available to more homes. What's different now is that they can also, for those who have broadband access, they also can do augmenting program to parents so that they can teach the kids the lessons that they're seeing on TV. So I do think there's ways of thinking creatively about the vehicles where kids are already connected that are quasi-free access that parents and teachers can get connected with as well.
One other thing, if I could jump in, this is Lauren, just to add to this part of the discussion, is around, you know, we're talking about preparing parents to be able to do this different kind of, you know, support of their kids. And I'm also thinking that foundations could have a really important role in preparing educators and other, you know, educational professionals who are in schools to deal with the social emotional learning needs of this cadre of students who are going to be collectively coming back having, I don't know if it's too much to say, sort of a collectively having experienced this sort of trauma of you know, being out for a period of time, being disconnected from their social networks, and there's going to be, you know, that follow-on shadow of this experience that will last for a long time. And it seems like a lot of school districts and folks have been thinking about supporting teachers in the social emotional learning and realm, but that's going to be needed even more. And having the support services in schools to be able to, you know, bridge those connections.
So kind of continuing along this conversation, you know, we've been talking a little bit about, you know, the need for immediate response and the longer term impact. We've got a question from somebody that's asking about, you know, the possibility for creating strategic collaborations between funders, where those that are best equipped to meet those short and medium term needs do so, and those that are best supported for the long term impact can fund a national blueprint for rebuilding and recovery policies with a focus on education and, you know, really focusing on parents in that role as their child's educator and connecting those parents with schools as a way to address some of the disparities that are being highlighted and exacerbated in this crisis. Does anybody have any thoughts about that question? And before somebody responds, I'm just going to share with everybody that I'm launching that poll that I mentioned at the beginning. So while I hope you continue the conversation, I just want to also encourage you to share your thoughts and feedback with us. But any thoughts about how funders, you know, could kind of play different roles based upon how they are situated to either do that short-term focus or the longer-term focus, but collaborating together, funder collaborations?
Well, you know, Sarah, I'm certainly seeing our live discussion last Friday, and the recording is up on our website on our COVID-19 page, was all about collaboration, where we had 2 funders in one town along with the director of the YMCA. And they talked about how they were working with 6 other funders in this town, consolidating applications. I'm not sure this is the right word, but sort of refereeing it so that everybody didn't fund one thing. The YMCA was stepping up and making their space available for warehousing of supplies as they came in. So there are opportunities for collaboration. What worked particularly well in that situation was that collaborative community existed before the virus. So where they might have met quarterly, now they're meeting weekly, but the infrastructure was there. So again, similar to thinking about what's going to happen next, we need to be thinking about those kinds of collaborations in the funding community, in the education community, and I'm talking here on a local level, not like part of major, nationwide organizations. And then those two getting together so that they're coordinated in what they're doing. And also to think, I always suggest that funders take a few steps left or right of the issue. So if I'm standing right in front of you, Sarah, and I look at you like you are on the screen right now, I see one image. If I move to a 45-degree angle, you haven't changed, but I see it differently. So as funders, look at things a little bit differently. Understand that maybe I fund this, but if I walk 10 feet over here and look differently, there's really this other need that is supporting what my passion is about. So open your mind, open your eyes, open your ears, and really think about what the issue is and not necessarily just quote unquote what you do.
Great advice, and I love how illustrative it is. We have maybe time for one more question, and this is a little bit of a policy question, but also getting at some of the issues that many of you have lifted up in terms of, the disparities in access to services. So relative to policy, do you know if there's any consideration for additional help for community health centers at the national level, but also in community level, or if there's a role for philanthropy in doing this, as we see hospitals and, the medical funding and how those are being drained and overused, we know that a lot of children and families have lacked access to healthcare services before this happened. Where's the opportunity to change the system so that we're addressing those access issues now?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I'll just sort of jump in real quick. That's what I was alluding to when Henry and I were first talking about that fragile or sort of precarious kind of infrastructure. One thing that foundations could consider is in this setting when there needs to be even more bridging of the gap between healthcare delivery and community services that families are going to need. And we just spent, the last bit of time thinking about all the increased needs that are going to be generated by this crisis. To what extent can foundations support the use of community health workers or other community health center personnel who can help bridge that gap, who could even do active outreach to families? Because as you know, a lot of times families aren't coming in now because they're being essentially dissuaded to even come, because if they have something that's not, acute or critical, healthcare providers saying, please, don't come because we need our space for folks who are more seriously ill. But those families still have needs that would have been detected. So one thing I would suggest or to consider is community health workers, and the other is helping health settings incorporate a comprehensive and universal screening for social needs into their delivery of healthcare. That varies quite a bit now, where some healthcare settings doing a really great job of doing that in a robust and, again, sort of comprehensive and uniform way, whereas other settings might do it in a little bit more of a hit or miss or not have it incorporated in the medical, the electronic medical record, et cetera. So, if we're talking about those basic needs, having a sense of what those are and detecting that or identifying those across entire populations would be really helpful. And I think that's something that foundations could do.
If I can just add to that quickly, I think the other thing is we know that, as we've said, government has to step up. The government, has the resources to do the kind of changes that we absolutely need. And so philanthropy supporting advocacy to make sure that government is informed about the important needs at the local level of low-income people, people of color, stepping up those kinds of that support for advocacy to make sure that those voices are heard.
Right, and that's using some of those other superpowers that they have in terms of their social capital and their ability to convene and ask those questions. So totally agree, David.
I love that term, Lauren, the superpowers of philanthropies. I'm going to keep using that. I'll try to give you credit. So we have come to about the end of our hour and a half together. But before we close, I would just like to extend a deep and heartfelt thank you to our moderator, our presenters, and our commentators today. Thank you, Henry, Lauren, Tony, Alicia, Kyle, and David for joining us, for sharing your insights about what lies ahead in this immediate short term, but as well as our, the long-term view of our work to ensure a strong support or strong system of family supports now and in the future. And I'd also like to say thank you to all of us, or all of you who joined in on this conversation. I hope that you will continue to join us next Tuesday and beyond. You can see some of the dates that we have upcoming. And I also hope that you'll make plans to join us for GLR Week 2020 in July. Again, that's July 13th through 17th. So I hope that you will make plans to join us for that. Thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and rest of your week. And continue your great work. And be well. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.